So we are getting to the end, but we're in a really interesting point where we're going to talk now about the ethics of digitalization. And I've got some fantastic guests for you on stage. We have the founder and CEO of Eticas Consulting, Dr. Gemma Galdo-Clavell. How do I do?
Great.
Okay. We've also got the chair, computational social science, University of California at Davis. It's the second best UC campus, second to UCLA, Professor Martin Hilbert, and we've got the Chief Social and Economic Policy, UNICEF, Dr. Dominic Richardson. I think we have 3 PhDs on stage. That's a little scary. All right. However, 4. To kick us off, I'm very pleased that virtually we now have joining us the co-founder of Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, Jonathan Zittrain. Jonathan, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Edie. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you. So let me ask you, should digital well-being be a right?
Great question. And I guess to answer it, I want to focus on the word digital. Because if we ask, should well-being be a right? Well, we certainly hope everybody has well-being, but we want to make it more specific. And to ask it about the digital environment is really to ask the question, is there something consistently special and especially worrisome about the digital environment? And I think the answer to that is yes. So let me just give an example. I think we're familiar with the prospect of automated autonomous vehicles, maybe even quite excited about it. You don't have to drive yourself or have somebody drive you. Now the car will drive you for you. Maybe there's even a conference table in the middle of the car and you can sit around it and have coffee while the car takes you somewhere. But it also opens up all sorts of new opportunities because it's digitally mediated for unexpected control. So for example, perhaps an arrest warrant issues for somebody, and if they're in a vehicle at that moment, the doors lock themselves and the car simply drives the person to the nearest police station and drops them off like a package. Or perhaps if somebody is feeling unwell, they can declare an onboard emergency in their car, and it will automatically, at a very high speed, rush them to the nearest hospital, while all the other cars in their way automatically part in order to let them through. Or perhaps if there were a national disaster happening, I don't know, some kind of hurricane or earthquake or something, there's an evacuation that's called for, your car can tell you, I'm leaving in 20 minutes. That's how much time you have to put your family and your belongings in, and then I'm going with or without you by the safest, most coordinated route. Now, are all these good ideas? I don't know, but they have something to do with the power of the digital environment, entirely new power to predict and to influence behavior, what previously was left to chance. So there's all sorts of definitions of well-being, including the previous conversations definition that has to do with how much we're lost in the virtual world versus conversing in the real world with others. The well-being I'm thinking about is a well-being about our own autonomy and the ways in which the rapidly expanding digital world can either enhance that autonomy or limit it. And we see it in the automated vehicle example. We see it in the news feeds of various social networks that we might use. What goes into those news feeds might look like it's by chance or organic, but there's all sorts of opportunity to salt them one way or the other, and that can help frame the reality that we understand. I know one of our fellow panelists, I think, is planning to discuss particular solicitude owed in this environment for children. And I think in some ways, all of us are as if we are children online because we can be monitored and measured so thoroughly and susceptible to influence in roundabout ways. It makes all of us somewhat naive. And that's something that when I start thinking about rights with a capital R, things that should be established, that establish kind of zones where others should not tread in the interests of our freedom, that's where I would be starting to think about rights. So this cycle of expanded power thanks to the digital environment is still in its infancy, but it's growing quickly. And You saw earlier in the afternoon a lot of talk, and I think justified excitement about the metaverse, but it's the metaverse that could really expand those opportunities for monitoring, for subtle influence and control. And the use of AI can scale monitoring and control in ways that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And that's why I think it's time to start articulating what the responsibilities should be for different parties. I think for governments, we need clearly articulated restrictions on the use of government power, transparency about its exercise, and independent third parties, such as the judiciary, who can keep the government honest, given the extra power that they're going to wield. For companies, I think that means what we call a fiduciary standard, owing loyalty to the interests of their users, even where it might conflict with the interests of the company. If I'm going to entrust so much of my data, and we're talking metaverse, it's my heartbeat, it's my eye movements, it's all sorts of things around which inferences can be made about me. If I'm entrusting that to that platform, then they ought to be owing me the kind of duty that we think that lawyers might owe their clients, that doctors might owe their patients, to look out for them and to help them navigate this new complicated world in ways that they can understand. And finally, I would just say, we want to keep an eye out for one another. What are the duties that we owe one another ethically as we encounter each other in this world, given the amount of power we each might bear to have an impact on the life of others? So should digital well-being be a right? Yes, it should. And it's going to require some creative infrastructure to bring that about, because it's anything but self-enforcing these rights. So we have our work cut out.
All right,
Thank you.
stay there, Jonathan. Gemma, I'm going to ask you the same question. What do you think? Should digital well-being be a right?
I'd say yes and no. I think that digital well-being is already not a right but a value. So our legal systems are based on values. We don't have a law for trust, but laws are about building trust among people. We don't have a law for social cohesion, but we want to protect social cohesion through our laws. Well-being is part of those values that we want to protect through our laws. The problem, and this is where ethics lives. So we have laws, and that's compliance, and then you have the values of society. And in ethics, what we're trying to see is which values should make it into the legal systems, and how values are translated into specific practices. And so we go from the societal values to laws to practices. And then the practices are supposed to be compliant and also reinforce the values that we care about. That is not happening, not because we're not recognizing well-being and digital well-being as a value, not because we don't have laws, but because we don't have practices. So we know we care about this. Like all the discourses today have been about, we are concerned about this. We fear for our children, we fear for ourselves, we don't know what's happening with our data, with our systems, with what's happening around us. We're like overwhelmed by technology because we don't have those practices. So we are failing at building that ecosystem of practices that will help us make sure that digital well-being is not only a right, but a value that is specifically upheld and protected.
So frameworks are important. And you also, I think about the legal framework. How could we use what we have already better, do you think?
There's so much we can do. Like, we know the what. We know that we want technology to protect people, to not discriminate, to be fair. We know all that. We know we want to protect children. We don't know how. So the crucial matter right now is the how. What are the tools that these laws have enabled us to develop that will allow us to effectively protect people and uphold those values? We work on algorithmic audits, for instance. That's one way of opening the black box of AI and seeing how a social media algorithm works. How does it create addiction? What are the triggers that mean that it is not just a game, but something that can be bad for people's mental health? So we need to understand those systems, and we need to be able to audit them to see where did the designers made a business decision that has social impacts that are harmful. We're also working on algorithmic leaflets. What if pieces of technology and algorithms came like medicine with a little document that tells you about how they work? What are the ingredients of the algorithm? What is the data? What it does? How to use it? If we had that, at least we'd have some level of protection. We're also working on algorithmic registries. We should know when an algorithm is making decisions about us. So all algorithms should be declared to a central list so that we know that there's a database, there's an algorithm that is making decisions about my life chances, my education, how much money I get when I go to the bank and ask for a loan, whether I get a job on one of those websites that offers you jobs. We should know that this exists. But unfortunately, those practices are not generalized yet. So we have the principles, but not the practices. And I really think that the future belongs to those that are brave enough to start implementing the practices.
Fascinating. Okay. Dominic, we've heard children mentioned many times. UNICEF, children are at absolutely the center. For children, is it suitable to be distinguishing digital well-being from a sense of overall well-being, do you think?
Well, the simple answer, I think, is no. The digital world is part of a child's world. It has unique attributes, things we ought to be distinguishing. But we know that a child's well-being outside of the digital world influences their behavior in the digital world. We know the quality of family relationships is influential on their safety online and their good practices online. And we know how well they engage with the digital world can influence their personal development and their growth, their access to education, health information, agency. I mean, it touches on, well, now it touches on every aspect of a child's life. And the more we distinguish the digital world from, and I don't want to say the real world because that includes the digital world, I think the more we're missing out on opportunities to do right by the whole child, all aspects of their lives.
So digital sits within family education, children's well-being and development. How do you equip kids with the tools to do this? Is it right to regulate gaming time, for example, screen time? How should we reframe how we look at some of these questions?
Well, the issue for me has always been quality over quantity. It's not right to talk about screen time without understanding what's on the screen. I mean, you wouldn't want a child reading books full of rubbish for hours all day long and celebrate with your friends. My child reads an awful lot, but I don't know what they're reading, and indeed might be trash. So we need to distinguish quality, and I think that we're sort of getting there. The other thing is that I think that we need to learn from history in terms of how we may have been scared by new technologies in the past, whether it be telephones, televisions, and one of our colleagues was sharing a picture of saying the young people read too many novels these days from the 1800s. I mean, it's simply. I think that I've heard a couple of times today, you know, is it a force for good? Is it a force for bad? You know, it's a false dichotomy. It's a tool. It's like saying, are you on the side of the wheel or you're against the wheel? It's just the wheel. We're using it for something. Okay, so what we need to understand is the quality of the tool and how it's used for children, less on the time. I think children's personal development requires ensuring that they have the toolkit to engage with the world around them and express their own agency and engage with the achievement of their own rights. If we close down any environment to children without understanding what we're leaving, you know, they're losing out, or sorry, what we're crowding out by sending them elsewhere or not giving them the opportunity to work with that environment, we're stifling their development. None of us can guess what the future economy is going to look like. Not one of us can guess how we're going to engage with friends in the future, in the long term, you know, or really what the world's going to become. Any time we spend between now and then holding back children because of old data and old ideas about screen time would be a shame on us. Let's be smarter. Let's talk about quality, and let's ensure that children can use everything the digital world offers for them in ways that promote their development.
Martin, how do you think about this?
I agree with all the points that were raised. So Jonathan, government regulation and corporate responsibility. Gemma said the technology, and Dominique, the content. I want to add another point to it, and that's kind of like where are we going? What's the characteristic of the human itself? So in our research, we've been after what we started to call digital immunity. And the question is, are there some people or some minds that are digitally immune to the downsides of digital manipulation, of persuasive technology? And the hypothesis started with the idea, okay, let's take what some cultures call an enlightened person or an awakened, some call it like this, or psychologists call it a transcendent mind, somebody who transcended their mind, who's non-attached to their own thoughts and emotions. And if you're non-attached to your own thoughts and emotions, then you're also less attached to the manipulations these technologies do with your thoughts and emotions, because they're extensions of the mind. That's where they drag you. That's where they take you and drag you down the digital rabbit hole, right? So we could say a person that transcended their mind or is a master of their mind, as they say. The mind is a beautiful tool, but a horrible master. For most of us, it's a master. We cannot get rid of our thoughts and emotions, but an enlightened person, a self-transcendent person might. And then the question became in our research, what are the characteristics of these people? And eventually, do we all have to evolve there? Because artificial intelligence is there. We're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. So there are these digital mind extensions, and where does our mind have to evolve as a humankind? Because this evolutionary pressure between biological minds and artificial minds, it's kind of like it's on, right? And these technologies, they grab a bigger part every year of the superiority of our mind space. But they'll be here 4 hours a day, 6 hours a day. So it seems like they are winning the superiority of our mind space, right? So the question is, are there some among us who are more naturally immune, and what are the characteristics? And then later on, what could we do to foster that with a larger society?
So are there some characteristics of people who are more naturally immune?
Yes, there are. So, and there are for some things. So for some people who more transcended their mind, who are who mastered their mind. For example, we see that, for example, people, for them, it's easier to meditate, and people who observe their thoughts and emotions a lot, who don't get sucked in, they can just let go and switch, which is a very important skill, who have more third-person perspective to their thoughts. They are more immune to mental harms, envy, social comparison, and all of that. They might not be immune to misinformation, but they might act less on it. So we're trying to understand what is this concept and what are some practices that people can engage with in order to foster which kind of aspect of this immunity.
Interesting. Jonathan, I want to bring you back. I want you to reflect on anything that you've heard in particular from the panel, but also there's another question about, should we be thinking about just one digital right, or are there actually several ones that we should be considering?
Yes, and I think the panel's already done a great job at illustrating different perspectives on this and different possible rights. And just thinking about it a little bit, Martin's point about are some people more immune from the downsides than others, and then saying particular downsides, there's more than one, and maybe more than one immunity there. It suggests that it might be awfully hard to persuade adults that in order to do advanced digital stuff, they have to demonstrate or acquire a certain immunity to its downsides. But that's the kind of thing that might make sense for kids, that while those kids are in school, there might be some additions to their coursework and their extracurriculars that actually, I imagine Martin would be at the cutting edge of this, help them cultivate the kinds of maturity that they'll need to deal with the increased complication of the digital world. And as Dominic points out, the digital and the regular world are melding together. So it's not just about when they enter the digital world. That world is indistinguishable or so woven into the analog world that it's just about life skills at this point that maybe wouldn't have been as necessary before. And I just also really appreciate Gemma's sort of anchoring us in values, that before you're off to the races and talking about, well, what should the rights be here? Being able to say, well, these are the values that we stand for. This is what kind of world is a better world, and this is what kind of world we hope to avoid. And without really stopping to paint pictures of those worlds, I think it might be awfully difficult. And now you asked about one right or many. There's even, I hate to further complicate it, but a question of, are those rights universal? Or might they, talk about an analog concept, get back to geography again? So to pick up on the example of the autonomous vehicles, who would determine the rule set within that vehicle if something should happen and there's an unavoidable accident and which way the vehicle should go, the classic trolley problem, maybe that answer would be different in one jurisdiction to another. So as the car rolls across the border in my neck of the woods from Massachusetts to New Hampshire, the rule set changes and the car will behave differently as a way of allowing different governments to define different rights? Or should it be one set, somehow humanity comes together and agrees how that vehicle should behave wherever it happens to be located?
Fascinating. Gemma, let's pick up on that with you. When you think about AI, the values-based, given what we heard from Jonathan there, what should the seatbelts be?
I use the idea of the seatbelts a lot because I think it helps us understand a very complex idea. So humanity has been negotiating the impacts of innovation since forever. Every time we've come up with a new idea, we realize that it had good potential and bad outcomes. And so we've tried to maximize the good potential and minimize the bad outcomes. And so when cars were invented, and that's where the reference of the seatbelts comes in, and a lot of people have been using references to cars throughout today. When the car was invented, it didn't come with speed limits. It didn't come with emission limits. It didn't come with seatbelts. Roads didn't come with zebra crossings or red lights. These are the things that we as a society came up with to reconcile the potential of the car with its social impact. Because we know that cars are great to move around, but we also know that they can kill people, that they can ruin the environment. So we've tried to mitigate those harms. And we do that all the time. We've just had COVID-19 with the vaccines. We've all been vaccinated after the vaccines have gone through clinical trials. That is the way that we reconcile the potential of medicine with its social impacts. In the past, we would use humans as guinea pigs. We have learned that we don't want to do that. We are not that kind of society. We don't use the most vulnerable as guinea pigs. And so we go through clinical trials. And we have permissions and authorizations for the labs. Like everything around us is heavily regulated, both through self-regulation of the industry and also external regulation from governments. When we go to a supermarket, we know that everything may be more healthy, less healthy, but nothing will kill us because it's gone through a process. I always use the example of a yogurt. For a yogurt to get to you, the controls start with the cow. The temperature of the milk, how the cow is transported. Well, none of that we have in medicine, in automobiles, in supermarkets, none of that exists in AI. We do not have the seatbelts of AI. And so right now, it's like giving a car to a child. And a car without speed limits, without any kind of the tools that we need to reconcile the potential of the innovation with the social impact. And just an example to visualize how serious this is, because Jonathan was talking about autonomous cars. Do you know that most autonomous cars that are currently running in the US, running in real roads, were not designed to identify human beings outside of zebra crossings? Let that sink in. These are killing machines. And that is happening because there's no one looking at the specifications of those algorithms to identify when someone went through several very crucial steps before, we didn't have to go through very crucial steps before putting a killing machine into the streets, because it was cheaper to do it like this than to actually protect people in the design process of the technology. So I think that we desperately and urgently need seatbelts for AI.
Jonathan, I'm going to give you a chance to react. I can't actually see you. Crowd likes that. But Martin, do you have anything that you want to say about in respect to AI and the seatbelts and that?
Yeah. So the question is, what are the seatbelts? So for the driving, for example, and having, say, for some people they can, but for driving, for example, you would say, okay, what's important is the vision. So you need to have, some people need to have glasses, they're not allowed to drive. And some people, their eyes are so bad they can never fly an airplane. They would never be allowed, because even with glasses they would. So what are kind of like the eyesight we need to be able to confront AI? And that's kind of like what we're after with this digital immunity. Like what power over your mind do you need to have? How much a master of your mind do you need to be in order to get in the ring with AI? So to make sure that AI doesn't take you and drag.
Do you have some kind of license, like a driver's license?
Eventually, yes, or it can be like some people can handle Instagram, other people cannot, and some people might need some training, and the question is what is the kind of training? And the training, it's more like a sanitation of the mind. For example, we feel like people, in California we call it mindfulness, but people who are long-term meditators have a very good, who are more witness to their mind, we find out have a very good control, and they can get into the ring with AI and they can stop any time because they are used to even disconnect from their thoughts and emotions, so they can also disconnect from that. It's kind of like a sanitation that people do, and many ancient practices, ancient traditions actually point to that. So for example, well, during the pandemic, we all learned to wash our hands regularly. It's kind of like this. You have to sanitize, you have to wash your mind, at least for 20 seconds, with 70% of consciousness regularly in order to stay on board. And I would bet, for example, many ancient traditions have practices. So for example, here in Islamic states, people stop 5 times a day, and they don't only wash their hands during the wudu, they also kind of clear their mind. And I would imagine, I haven't seen a study, that's just an hypothesis, that there is an effect to kind of like just doing that. People don't stop anymore 5 times a day to wash their minds in consciousness and just be aware and take a break, because people are always on, always connected. And that gets them into this stimulus response, unconscious, mindless drag that these pervasive technologies drag us into.
Fascinating. Jonathan, I'm going to come back to you, but Dominic, I want to bring you back into this. Do you think about AI when you think about children's and rights? And I wonder this because, we think about, for example, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, written 33 years ago. It took a long time to get a lot of countries to pass it. Is there anything in there that we can use that might be useful in this discussion?
Yeah, thanks, Edie. In fact, I think almost every country in the world has signed and ratified the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child. There's just one laggard, and you'd be surprised to hear who it is. The United States still hasn't.
Doesn't surprise me, unfortunately.
Ratified the convention. And there's a lot in there, because I mean, the convention, at least 4 occasions, talks about committing to children's mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being. And that's not simply just at home or in their bedroom or in the school, in the classroom, it's everywhere. The Article 2 of non-discrimination requires that children, wherever they're born, the accident of birth should not affect how the child is treated in any actor that has any relation to the child at all, whether it be the government minister or the teacher or indeed the family situation. The child should be treated equally as to all other children. And then there's issues related to children's evolving capacities, which is where you bring in the discussion around children's ability to have their voices heard, to represent their own opinions and achieve their own rights. And what's really neat about the convention is that it still applies today. It sets basic standards for what we should do for children, whatever the environment, so digital too. But it does something neat, which brings together 2 parts of the discussion we've been hearing, which is, maybe there's a higher order skill for interpreting figurative speech, because we all like metaphors, don't we? And I'm going to play on what you've been saying. So to some degree, Martin's been saying, well, there's an individual action and position and being, a way the individual can manage the environment better, washing the mind and being able to engage with the situation. And Gemma's telling us that some of the equipment in that environment in and of itself is dangerous equipment, right? So it's a bit like having lots of knives around, but also teaching the child not to touch the knives, or regulating those knives out of existence. And the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child speaks not only to the actors around the child and what they should do to regulate the environment, to improve the conditions and achieve basic standards for all children everywhere, but it talks of how the child themselves can become capacitated, for what's a horrible term, right? Can develop to be actors in their own right and work within this environment to the best of their ability. So if we were to use the convention as a starting point for child development, unique potential, their own flourishing, then engagement with the digital world would be better. Imagine if everybody's affective empathy here or cognitive empathy was absolutely tip-top, the best you could get. You know the room would be a warmer place to be in. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be putting our mechanisms of state to promoting children's social and emotional development and their toolkit for life. So,
Makes sense. Jonathan, I'm going to bring you back in. Anything you heard you wanted to reflect on? I also am dying to ask you about, in the description of this panel, it talks about the right to be forgotten. And I know that you're working on a book right now about the different eras of digital governance. I'd love you to say more about that and whether that right sits in there.
Great, thank you, Edie. So first, I'm taken with some of Gemma's examples, which are both great examples and serve, I think, as valuable metaphor back to our autonomous vehicles. At one level, I feel like, Gemma, you're prompting us to think about just what are the right standards for safety and who should be in a position to demand them with these highly kinetic vehicles that are going out and about. And I think those are really complicated questions. It might turn out that these vehicles are on balance far safer than having fallible humans at the wheel and getting distracted and tired and sleepy. On the other hand, those autonomous vehicles might fail in very strange ways, so that every so often one of them just makes a right angle turn right into a sidewalk and hits a bunch of people on the sidewalk. How do we weight those things together? And that gets back to our values. Are there people who are mere bystanders and need to be especially protected versus other drivers for whom we're all sort of reciprocally taking on the risks there? So that's one kind of question I think we have to ask about all these technologies. The other question is a kind of higher order one, which is who is stewarding the embedding of values into technology? Now, I think that question applies even with something as basic as the wheel, but the wheel is pretty much a known quantity at this point. It's a product. It's not going to surprise you so much. These things, these technologies we're talking about, particularly AI technologies that might act differently on Wednesday than they did on Monday in ways that even the people who made them and programmed them can't predict. That's a feature, not a bug, but that could also be a bug because the question then is, well, who is responsible for what's happening there? And it actually calls to mind for these rapidly developing, often in the private sector, and therefore subject to trade secret and not exactly writing academic papers about it, is the framework it's permitted if it's not explicitly forbidden, or is the framework it's forbidden if it's not explicitly permitted? And the first is what gave us the burst of innovation of the digital world. Let people build stuff, and then if problems arise, we try to deal with them. But that is a bit of a kind of white-knuckled way to go about developing these technologies that can affect us so much. So in just real brief, you asked about the eras of governance that I'm writing about. And I described the first, and it's in some ways from a very American perspective, as a rights era, something about individual freedoms and the ways in which early digital technology opened up those freedoms. I can communicate with whomever I want, and nobody can get in my way. That's a first era of the way in which a lot of people were thinking about these digital technologies. A second is public health, saying, well, that might all be well and good for you, but what's it doing to the overall environment that we're in? Maybe you got yourself a fast car, but here's the impact your car is having on others. And how do we start thinking about that? That's the public health set of values. And finally is what I call the process sort of values. It says, we're never going to really reconcile rights and public health. In the right to be forgotten, there's the right of somebody not to have some mistake or statement, even if it's true about them from 20 years ago, be the very first thing on a Google search about them forevermore. On the other hand, there's the right of the public to know what's going on and to be able to freely communicate. So process is a way of saying, here at least are some boundaries, some rules of the road that say, however temporarily, how we're going to resolve these questions. And because we're not going to settle all this stuff, even if our panel had more time, which I'm aware it probably does not. We're not going to actually be able to conclude, but feeling ways to at least reach sort of temporary kind of perching points where we feel like, all right, now we're ready for the next one. It just means that debate will be continuing onward for the years to come.
You mentioned there, Jonathan, the right to be forgotten, and it's a little bit different when Google's involved. Dominic, I know you've thought about this as well. Do we have to really change the way we think about rights?
Well, this is where I said at the beginning, there's some unique aspects and attributes to the digital world, and I think we need, as a group, need to turn our mind to sort of identifying those, be very clear about them. And one of them is when we're talking about cyberbullying and UNICEF, and we're talking about, when I was a kid, if I wrote something on the wall about my classmate, somebody would come and wash it off. It would be gone next week. But if I wrote it on Facebook, or if I left, it can be churned and kept forever and ever. And that just doesn't damage the child who's seeing this, indelible negative statement about them and their lives. But the child who wrote it is also not going to be forgotten in terms of where it came from. Now, when I was 14 and 15, let's leave it there. I'm sure we all got the same. But I had the right to reimagine my character and restate my position as an adult as sensible, grown up and mature, because people couldn't look through my history and see the mistakes I made as a child, things that would have been forgotten in my past. And the digital technology doesn't allow that anymore, and it's a worrying situation. Who knows where it's going to end up, but if we can get ahead of the problem, we ought to.
Really fascinating. Obviously, girls were much more advanced than boys. Gemma, you and I have nothing that we would have liked to be forgotten. But tell me, Gemma, what do you think is coming down the line when we think about this question?
I think it's really important to realize that the future will not be like the past. What has been allowed in the last few years is not allowed anymore. In Europe, we have like 4 new laws being passed in the next few months on AI alone. China just passed a law on privacy that is even better than GDPR in Europe. We don't know why they passed it, but they passed it. Biden is bringing back all the efforts by the Obama administration in this respect. So the things that were allowed in the recent years will not be allowed anymore. And so the industry needs to step up their game. The lazy innovation that they have practiced in the past, where they overlooked really important steps and they forgot to put people and the protection of people at the center of what they were doing, is not acceptable anymore, will not be acceptable anymore by the legislation and by the population. So I think that what's coming down the line is the development of those tools that will ensure not only that we have a regulatory ecosystem that ensures that we have seatbelts for AI, but also a demand from the population that we will not buy the technology that does not respect our rights. We will learn how to differentiate between healthy technology, healthy solutions, and unhealthy solutions. So I'm quite hopeful about the future, but I think that we need those tools, those specific tools that will make up the ecosystem. And we need society to come up with those tools. I mean, the seatbelt was not invented by a regulator in an office. It was invented by Volvo. It was the industry that stepped up and said, I'm gonna be leading in these solutions. We have governments that have put forward things that have made our lives better. Who are gonna be the governments and the companies that are gonna shape this near future and that are gonna help us trust technology again, because I think we are losing our trust in technology however we like it. We like it, but we don't trust it. So who are going to be the governments and who are going to be the companies? And I would like to see more of the Middle East in that conversation, because it's very much an alive conversation in Europe, Latin America, and the US. But I don't hear a lot of voices from the Middle East in Europe. So I just hope that the future conversation is also more of a global conversation, because I think there's a lot to bring from this part of the world. I think that the sense of community that comes from Middle Eastern cultures, I'm Spanish, so it's not that far away of a culture for me, that can bring a lot of things, because it's not an individual problem.
Right.
Like, if I have to say one thing, stop feeling guilty. It's not about you and how you're failing as a parent or as a student. This is a collective issue. And we need to demand that regulators and the market step it up and protect us. It's not about how much we understand, how much we know, how much we can understand what an algorithm is. It is not about us. It is unfair to put the weight of the responsibility on individuals. It's
Okay.
other people who need to work on this.
All right, so I'm going to give you guys a chance to give us a very brief call to action. So Martin, what is your call to action for the audience, for the people listening?
I think my call to action, I think Ithra has already made a big step, and it's really admirable. We understand very little about that. We would like to regulate it, but we still, I mean, this Web 2.0 social media is not even 20 years in, and it's a battle of the superiority of our minds. And we do not understand actually what are the characteristics of the minds. What we do know from our research is intelligence doesn't help you here. Cognition does not help you, but what are the characteristics of a mind that is able to get into the ring with AI and keep the superiority? And in our surveys, recently in our study, we tested 30 different measures of consciousness. And you'll be surprised, as I said, the normal personality and intelligence, it's not. There's actually more mystical, spiritual characteristics that are actually really powerful. So we understand very little what will be needed in the next 100 years in order to keep up the evolutionary pressure with artificial minds.
All right. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm going to ask Dominic and I'm going to ask Jonathan to issue their calls to action via their social media tonight. Not today, but I want to thank very much all of my panel for joining me here. Let's give them a nice round of applause.